All right, Donald Trump thought winning the White House a second time meant the fighting was finally over. 18 months ago, he stood on that stage in Palm Beach, victory blazing across every screen in America, and told the world the comeback was complete. Right now, a judge just made a decision that tells a completely different story. The allies who celebrated that night, the advisors, the deal makers, the inner circle who believed political victory meant legal immunity, they're silent, not regrouping, not fighting back, silent. What happened between that victory speech and this moment is the story nobody in Washington wants to tell. Because this isn't about who won the election. This isn't about red versus blue or MAGA versus the resistance. This is about a judge who looked at the evidence, looked at the names on the documents, and said two words that just froze an entire political empire in place. Not yet. That's what he told everyone who thought this chapter was closed. And when you understand what he ordered next, you'll see why Trump's most loyal allies are suddenly thinking about their own lawyers instead of his. So what pushed this judge to make a decision this explosive at this particular moment? One filing, one set of documents, one legal argument that Trump's team made believing it would end the fight and instead accidentally handed the court exactly what it needed to go further. Not narrower, further. But here's what matters. This wasn't a surprise attack from a hostile system. This was years of accumulated evidence, finally finding the right courtroom at the right moment with the right judge sitting in the chair. See, most people think this story started when Trump won in November. It didn't. It started long before the ballots were counted, in document trails and financial structures and legal filings that were quietly building a case while everyone was focused on polls and rallies and debate performances, records that showed patterns that showed decisions that now have specific names attached to them in a court document that is permanently, irrevocably part of the public record. That's not a footnote. That's not a minor procedural development buried on page 12 of a legal brief. That's a foundation. And what gets built on top of it is what has everyone frozen right now. Federal cases tied to the Justice Department, those looked vulnerable. A president has enormous influence over federal prosecutors. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's how the system works. And sure enough, several federal-level matters started losing steam almost immediately after the election results came in. But here's what those allies forgot, or maybe what they never fully understood. Not every case runs through Washington. Not every judge answers to a federal appointment. Not every prosecutor has to think about who's sitting in the Oval Office when they decide whether to push forward or pull back. Some of these battles are being fought in state courts, in civil chambers, in jurisdictions where the president's influence ends the moment you walk through the courthouse door. And that's exactly where this new ruling just landed, like a thunderclap nobody heard coming. Let's go back to where this actually starts. Because this moment didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built brick by brick, case by case, over years of legal maneuvering that most people stopped paying attention to because the news cycle moved too fast. When Trump was first president, his allies developed a strategy that worked beautifully. Delay, challenge, appeal, attack the process, attack the prosecutors, attack the judges, drag everything out long enough that it either dies in the courts or becomes irrelevant. It's not a glamorous strategy, but it's an effective one. And surrounded by loyalists who'd spent years mastering the art of legal delay, Trump emerged from his first term without a single conviction. That experience created something dangerous. Confidence. Not just ordinary confidence, but the kind that makes people stop running the scenarios where things go wrong, the kind that makes advisors stop asking hard questions because the boss doesn't want to hear them. So when the second term started, the inner circle walked in believing the legal chapter was closed. A few remaining civil matters here, a state case there, nothing that couldn't be managed, minimized, or made to disappear through political pressure and procedural chess. What they miscalculated was the judge. His name isn't important for the drama of this story, but his record is. Because this is someone who has spent decades on the bench watching powerful people walk into his courtroom believing the rules don't apply to them. He's seen the expensive suits and the teams of lawyers and the quiet assumption that money and influence translate directly into favorable outcomes. And he has spent his entire career proving that assumption wrong. When the filing landed on his docket, people close to the case say the Trump team wasn't particularly worried. They had arguments, they had precedent they believed supported their position. They had a legal team that had successfully fought off bigger threats in more hostile territories. What they didn't have was a read on this judge. Because the moment he started asking questions in the preliminary hearings, something shifted in the room. This wasn't a judge looking for a way out. This wasn't a judge waiting for someone to hand him a procedural escape hatch that would let everyone walk away without a real decision. This was a judge who had read every page, considered every argument, and arrived in that courtroom already knowing exactly what he thought. The Trump legal team realized it too late. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. And I want you to stay with me here, because this next part is what separates the real analysis from the noise. The ruling itself, the actual decision that has everyone frozen, it's not what you might expect. It's not a criminal conviction. It's not a prison sentence. It's something in some ways more strategically dangerous than either of those things. The judge issued a sweeping decision that doesn't just affect the immediate case, it establishes boundaries, parameters, legal lines that Trump allies will now have to navigate for the foreseeable future. It blocks certain financial maneuvers that were being planned. It forces disclosure of documents that the Trump organization had spent enormous resources keeping sealed. And it does something that lawyers are calling genuinely unprecedented in this particular legal context. It names names. Not just Trump. Not just the organization as an abstract entity. Specific individuals, specific advisors, specific allies who were explicitly identified in the ruling as having participated in conduct the judge found troubling enough to address directly in his written decision. Think about what that means for a moment. These are people who believed they were operating in the background, safe behind the shield of organizational distance. Advisors who gave advice, lawyers who structured deals, associates who moved money, all of them suddenly very visible, very specifically named in a court document that is now part of the public record. That's why the allies are frozen, not because of what happened to Trump, because of what just happened to them. Let me tell you about the phone calls that happened in the hours after the ruling dropped. Because this is where you really start to understand the magnitude of what just occurred. High-priced attorneys got pulled out of meetings. Partners at firms that have built decades of relationships with Trump world suddenly found themselves in emergency consultations with clients who 24 hours earlier thought they had nothing to worry about. The question being asked over and over again was some version of the same thing. Does this affect me directly? And the honest answer, the one that good lawyers were forced to give, even when it wasn't what their clients wanted to hear, was possibly, depending on what comes next. Depending on whether the other side decides to use this ruling as a foundation for additional action. Because that's the thing about a ruling that names names. It doesn't just punish, it creates a map. A documented, court-certified, legally authoritative map of who was where, doing what, when, and anyone who appears on that map has now just become infinitely more valuable to prosecutors, investigators, and civil litigants looking for their next angle. One veteran legal analyst put it this way, when asked to explain the significance. He didn't use dramatic language. He just said, when a federal judge puts your name in a ruling like this, your life gets more complicated. Full stop. The reaction from Trump's public allies has been exactly what you'd expect. Loud, performative, full of the familiar language about judicial overreach and political persecution and weaponized courts. But listen carefully to what's underneath the volume, because there's something different this time. In previous legal fights, the pushback from Trump world had a certain confidence underneath it. A certainty that the courts would eventually bend, that appeals would succeed, that the system would find a way to produce the outcome that political reality demanded. Even when they were angry, even when they were furious, the underlying message was always, don't worry, we've got this. That message is notably absent right now. What you're hearing instead from people close to the situation, not the public spokespeople, but the actual operators, the ones who understand legal strategy and speak to each other honestly, is something closer to concern. A genuine reckoning with the possibility that this particular judge in this particular jurisdiction has just created a problem that won't be easily appealed away. Because the documentation in this ruling is meticulous. The judge didn't leave gaps, didn't leave convenient procedural arguments. Didn't give the appeals court an obvious off-ramp. He wrote a ruling that appears to have anticipated every counter-argument and addressed it directly. That's not an accident. That's a judge who knew exactly what he was building. Here's what most coverage is missing. And this is the part that I think matters most for understanding where this goes from here. The people closest to Trump, the true inner circle, not the public faces, but the ones who actually move the pieces. They had a plan for every legal scenario they thought was possible. They had a plan for conviction, a plan for acquittal, a plan for appeals, a plan for delays. They had spent years gaming out the scenarios and building responses. They did not have a plan for this. Not because this was unforeseeable, but because they convinced themselves it wouldn't happen. That the political environment would change fast enough to make it irrelevant. That the judge would see which way the wind was blowing and find reasons to rule narrowly rather than broadly. That someone would intervene. That something would shift. Nothing shifted. And now they're scrambling to build a response to a situation their planning never fully accounted for. That scrambling looks like chaos from the outside. The contradictory statements, the allies who are suddenly harder to reach, the public defenders who are speaking in more cautious language than usual. It looks disorganized because it is disorganized. Not because these people are incompetent, but because genuine surprises produce genuine disarray. And this ruling was a genuine surprise. Let me take a step back for a moment, because I think it's important to do something that most coverage of this story isn't doing. Let me give you the other side. Trump's defenders have an argument here, and parts of it are worth taking seriously. They'll tell you that this judge was predisposed against Trump, that the ruling is a product of a judicial system in certain jurisdictions that has been radicalized by political opposition, that the naming of specific allies is an overreach, a form of judicial intimidation designed to punish people for their political associations rather than their actual legal conduct. They'll point to the broader pattern, the number of legal actions targeting Trump and his circle. The fact that prosecutors and judges in certain jurisdictions have at times made public statements that suggested less than perfect neutrality. They'll ask the question that some legal scholars are also asking. At what point does aggressive prosecution become persecution? Those questions deserve real answers. And the honest answer is that the line between accountability and overreach isn't always clean. Courts in polarized environments can reflect that polarization. Legitimate legal action and politically motivated legal action can sometimes look identical from the outside, but here's what makes this particular ruling different from that argument. The documentation, the specificity, the careful construction of a decision that addresses counter-arguments before they're made. This doesn't read like a political hit job dressed up in legal language. This reads like a judge who did the work and reached conclusions he felt the evidence compelled. You can disagree with those conclusions. Trump's team certainly does. But disagreeing with a well-documented ruling is different from claiming it's fraudulent. And right now, even some of the more credible voices on the right are having a hard time finding the actual substantive errors. Now let's talk about where this goes. Because the ruling is one thing, what happens next is everything. The immediate legal response from Trump's team will be an appeal. That's guaranteed. The grounds for that appeal are already being drafted by lawyers who are very good at their jobs and who will find every possible argument worth making. Some of those arguments might succeed. Appeals courts have modified and overturned aggressive lower court rulings before, sometimes for legitimate legal reasons, sometimes for reasons that are harder to explain. But here's the timeline problem that Trump's allies are staring at. Appeals take time, months, sometimes years. And the things this ruling sets in motion, the document disclosures, the named individual exposure, the additional legal avenues it opens for other litigants and investigators, those things don't wait for the appeal to conclude. Every day the ruling stands, even under appeal, is a day that other actors, prosecutors in other jurisdictions, civil litigants who've been watching for an opening, journalists who now have a court-certified map of activity to investigate, are using what this judge just gave them. The ruling is a seed, and right now it's just been planted. What grows from it will depend on how aggressively people decide to water it. Letitia James's office is already paying attention. Prosecutors in 2 other states are, according to sources familiar with the situation, actively reviewing the ruling for implications relevant to their own ongoing matters. And at least 3 civil suits that had been dormant are reportedly being reconsidered by attorneys who see this ruling as having shifted the legal landscape in their favor. That's the multiplier effect. That's what makes this moment different from a single legal loss in a single courtroom. It's the way one decisive ruling, built on solid documentation and made by a judge who clearly wasn't going to flinch, can suddenly become the foundation for everything that comes after it. There's a scene I keep thinking about, not from a courtroom, but from a campaign rally. One of the ones where Trump is at his most confident. The crowd is enormous, the energy is electric, and Trump is standing up there talking about how the legal cases are all falling apart, how the system tried to stop him and failed, how nobody can touch him anymore. And the crowd believes it. Why wouldn't they? He won. He's president. The prosecutions that everyone thought would end his political career ended up fueling it instead, turning legal liability into political invincibility. That narrative made sense until about 48 hours ago. Because what this ruling just demonstrated, quietly but unmistakably, is that the story Trump was telling about legal immunity through political victory was always more fragile than it sounded. It worked for certain kinds of cases, it didn't work for this kind, and now everyone who bet their futures on the narrative being true is sitting in offices and on phone calls trying to figure out what they do next. The frozen allies. That's the image that keeps coming back to me. Not running. Not fighting. Frozen. Because freezing is what happens when smart, experienced people who thought they'd already won suddenly realized the game changed when they weren't watching. Here's what's really at stake. And I mean, really. Not legally, not politically, but in terms of what this moment represents for how power actually works in America. There's been a theory operating in Trump world for years now. It's not unique to Trump, but he's expressed it more explicitly than most. The theory is that with enough political power, with enough public support, with enough control over the institutions that matter, a president and his allies become effectively untouchable. That elections are the ultimate accountability, and if the voters return you to power, that settles the question of whether the legal system gets to keep coming at you. This ruling is a direct challenge to that theory. Not because it defeats it completely. The theory still has significant real-world support, and there are plenty of ways Trump and his team can fight back. But it demonstrates that the theory has limits, that there are corners of the legal system that don't respond to political weather, that there are judges who genuinely don't care what the electoral map looked like in November, that accountability in a system built on laws doesn't always bow to accountability at the ballot box. That's uncomfortable for people across the political spectrum, actually, because the power of that principle cuts in every direction. In the same judicial independence that produces rulings Trump's allies hate is the same judicial independence that would produce rulings targeting a progressive president's allies under different circumstances. The principle doesn't care about your team. But right now, in this moment, it's Trump's team that's frozen in front of it. The next 30 days are going to tell us a lot. Not just about this case, but about whether the pattern holds. Will additional defendants named in the ruling face their own legal jeopardy? Will the documents that the judge ordered, disclosed, produce new information that becomes the basis for further action? Will the appeals court find substantive grounds to narrow or overturn the ruling, or will they let it stand? Every one of those outcomes produces a different downstream reality. A narrowed ruling gives Trump's team a partial victory they can amplify into a narrative of vindication. A fully upheld ruling makes the map this judge drew permanent legal territory. A ruling that produces new document disclosures opens doors nobody currently knows are there. Sources close to the situation say the next major development could come within weeks, not months. The pace of legal proceedings, which has been historically slow in many of these matters, appears to be accelerating. Whether that's because the courts genuinely want resolution or because the political pressure to move is overwhelming is something nobody knows for certain. What is certain is that the people who woke up the morning after Election Day believing the legal chapter was written have been given a very clear signal. The chapter isn't written. It's being revised in real time by judges who aren't waiting for permission. The thing that keeps legal observers up at night isn't actually this specific ruling. It's what comes next if this specific ruling survives appeal. Because precedent matters enormously in law, not just as an abstract principle, but as a practical tool that litigants on both sides use to argue their positions. A ruling that survives appeal becomes a foundation. Other lawyers cite it, other judges reference it. The logic it establishes becomes part of the legal landscape that everyone who comes after has to navigate. If this ruling stands, it will be cited in cases that have nothing to do with Trump. It will be used in jurisdictions across the country. It will appear in briefs filed by lawyers who've never been anywhere near this case, arguing points that seem entirely unrelated to what this judge decided. That's how law actually works. And that's why this moment, which looks like one ruling in one case, is actually much larger than that. It's a potential shift in how certain kinds of conduct are treated legally, a potential change in what judges feel empowered to do when the documentation of wrongdoing is overwhelming and the political figures involved are high profile. One former federal judge, speaking on background, put it in terms that stuck with me. He said, courts are supposed to be immune to political atmosphere. Mostly they are, but occasionally you get a moment where a ruling sends a signal to every court in the country about what's permissible, what's expected, what the system is willing to do. This might be one of those moments. He paused for a second and then added, or it might get reversed on appeal and nobody remembers it in 18 months. That's the honest answer. That's where we are. Let me tell you something about the way this kind of pressure actually manifests on real people. Because the frozen allies aren't just a political story. They're individuals. People who built careers around proximity to power. People who made decisions, gave advice, signed documents, participated in structures, believing they were protected by the scale and speed and noise of Trump world. Now, some of them are sitting with lawyers who are telling them things they didn't expect to hear, explaining exposure they didn't think they had, outlining scenarios they never prepared for. And the human response to that, the actual emotional experience of being named in a major court ruling when you thought you were safely in the background, that's something that changes people. Some of them will cooperate, if cooperation becomes the path out. History is very clear on this. When legal pressure lands on satellites rather than on the central figure, satellites have a way of finding reasons to talk. Not because they're disloyal necessarily, but because loyalty has natural limits when personal legal jeopardy becomes real and serious. That's the dynamic that the Trump team has always managed, with a combination of intimidation, reward, and the genuine belief among allies that the legal threats would never actually materialize. The belief kept the circle tight. The ruling just tested that belief. And if additional pressure follows, if the satellite figures start receiving their own subpoenas, their own inquiries, their own legal bills that are landing on their personal accounts and not on organizational ones, the circle that is held tight for years starts to face a different kind of pressure than it's ever faced before. Nobody knows yet which way that goes. But everyone who understands how these dynamics work is watching very closely. Here's what I think is the most important thing I can leave you with. This ruling is not the end of anything. I want to be clear about that. Trump has survived legal decisions before that looked equally catastrophic. His ability to absorb legal damage, to convert it into political fuel, to find ways around outcomes that would have destroyed ordinary public figures, that ability is genuinely extraordinary and shouldn't be underestimated. His team is not finished. His allies are frozen, but they're not gone. The appeal is real and it might produce real results. The political power of the White House provides tools and leverage that matter in ways both visible and invisible. But what this ruling does is something specific and important. It puts something in the record. Something documented, reasoned, specific, and public. Something that doesn't disappear because the political winds shifted. Something that future judges, future prosecutors, future juries, and future historians can point to and say, this happened, this was real, this is what the evidence showed. In a moment where so much of our political reality is contested and fluid and subject to revision depending on who's doing the talking, that kind of documented reality matters more than it might seem. The allies are frozen because they understand this. Because whatever comes next in the appeal, whatever political victories tomorrow brings, whatever narrative gets built around this moment, the ruling itself is now part of the permanent record. And somewhere in a courthouse that doesn't care what the approval ratings say, a judge just made sure of that. The question now isn't whether this happened. It happened. The question is what it sets in motion. And the answer to that question is going to take months, maybe years, to fully understand. But something broke open today. Something that was supposed to be over isn't over. And the people who thought they were watching the final act just realized they were actually watching the end of the first one. The next act is starting. And nobody, not Trump's allies, not his opponents, not the legal analysts, not the political strategists, knows exactly how it ends. But everyone is watching now. And trust me, what comes next is going to be bigger than anything that came before. The silence from Mar-a-Lago says everything. Usually, within hours of any legal development, the Truth Social posts start flying. The attacks come fast and furious. The statement from the communications team drops with carefully chosen language designed to make the whole thing sound like a minor inconvenience being handled by brilliant lawyers who have everything under control. This time, nothing. A silence so complete and so uncharacteristic that people who cover Trump full-time noticed it immediately. Reporters who have spent years tracking his every digital move were refreshing their feeds and finding nothing. Sources close to the inner circle weren't returning calls. The usual pipeline of background commentary that Trump world uses to shape narratives before stories fully form had gone completely dry. That silence is the most revealing thing that's happened since the ruling dropped. Because Donald Trump doesn't go quiet when he's confident. He goes quiet when he's calculating. When the people around him are having honest conversations that they can't afford to have on record. When the gap between the public performance and the private reality gets wide enough that maintaining both simultaneously becomes impossible for a moment. Right now, that gap is enormous. And everyone inside knows it. Here's what I'm told is actually happening behind the scenes. Legal teams that normally operate independently from each other, each handling their specific piece of the overall litigation puzzle, have been pulled into unified emergency sessions. The kind of coordination that only happens when something unexpected lands and the response needs to be architecturally rebuilt from scratch rather than simply adjusted. The question they're wrestling with isn't just how to appeal this ruling. It's how to contain what the ruling makes possible. How to get ahead of the document disclosures before they produce headlines. How to reach the named allies before those allies start making their own calculations about where their personal interests actually lie. That last problem is the one keeping people up at night. Because you can appeal a ruling, you can attack a judge, you can build a political narrative that turns legal defeat into fundraising triumph. Trump's team has done all of those things before and done them effectively. What you cannot do is control what happens inside the minds of people who just got personally named in a federal court document and are now sitting across from their own lawyers, hearing things they never expected to hear. That part is already out of anyone's hands. And that's what makes the next 30 days unlike anything we've seen before. And that's where we are right now. A ruling that wasn't supposed to happen? Allies who weren't supposed to be named? A silence from Mar-a-Lago that wasn't supposed to be this long? And a legal map that wasn't supposed to still be expanding in a post-election world where everyone assumed the battles were already over. The frozen allies will eventually thaw. They'll find their footing, craft their responses, return to the public fight with renewed energy and familiar language. Trump will post, the rallies will continue, the narrative machine will spin back up. But something fundamental shifted in that courtroom. Something that can't be unshifted by a press release or a Truth Social post or a campaign rally, no matter how loud the crowd gets. The record exists now, the names are in it, the documentation is public, and the judge who put it all there isn't asking anyone's permission to let it stand. If you've been watching this story thinking you already know how it ends, I'd encourage you to think again. Because the people closest to this situation, the ones who actually understand what just happened, they stopped thinking they knew how it ends about 48 hours ago. And they haven't started again yet.